Richard asked, how can I help my parents to sort themselves out? That's question one. How can I talk about the resentments of my child in a way that benefits them instead of giving them guilt? Yeah, well, those are two very difficult questions. How can you help your parents to sort themselves out? Well, I guess the first question would be, or do they want to sort themselves out? Because it's not that easy to help people if they don't want to be helped. If they do want to be helped, like listening is really a good strategy. You know, people, you got the question right, because you said, how can I help my parents to sort themselves out, which is very different than how can I sort my parents out. You help people to sort themselves out once they have decided to do so by giving them the opportunity to talk about their concerns and also to outline what potential solutions might be. And you don't want to offer too many pieces of advice while you're doing that, because it turns out that people are much more likely to implement a strategy of improvement if they generate it themselves. And then also, you don't steal the accomplishment from them. Like, let's say you came to me with a bunch of problems and I said, well, here's what you could do about that. And then you went out and did it and it worked. And then in some sense, that's not your accomplishment. I mean, it is insofar as you implemented, but it's not insofar as it was something that I planned. And your intimation of that, your intimation of the fact that the delight in success, in the responsibility for success might have been stolen from you by well-meaning advice, is going to interfere with the probability that you'll implement the solution. And so it's best to let people talk through their own problems. Like, well, what's the problem? That's what you ask. What's the problem? What do you think's not right about your life? And then people will throw out a bunch of things that they're complaining about or resentful about. And it might be quite an extensive list, and they'll feel guilty about it because they don't want to burden you with it. But they need to get it all off their chest, right? They need to get the cards on the table. It's also something to know when you're talking to your wife or your husband or your intimate partner or child, for that matter, someone you have a close relationship with, is if they've got some things to complain about, which they undoubtedly do, they're going to complain about a lot more things than they're actually upset about, because they'll have gathered up irritations that have been unspoken and aggravations and fears, and they'll all be upsetting them emotionally, and they don't know exactly what they are until they articulate them. You say, well, what are you upset about? Well, I don't know. Well, how can you not know? Well, the answer is there's all sorts of things that you respond to emotionally before you can articulate them. Then you get upset and you explode and you yell and you lay out all the things you might be angry about, and you're impulsive and you overstate your case and you accuse people of things that you don't even believe. All of that's part of the process of laying your cards out on the table. You have complex situations that are disturbing you, and you don't know what they are exactly. You have to kind of guess. So you say, well, it might be this, and it might be that, and it might be this, and it might be you, and this is why it's your fault. You get accusatory. And then if you're listening to all that, you have to just be patient and let the person get all their cards out on the table. Even if some of that involves accusations about you, which you don't have to immediately jump to the conclusion that those accusations are accurate or that you have to defend yourself. Believe me, I'm not saying this is easy, because it's not. But you listen to the person lay out their deck of complaints. And the first thing you'll find is that they will take 50% or maybe more, 75% of the cards off the table right away, because once they've articulated out those concerns, they'll find that they're not really central. They're not really the issue. And so that leaves a smaller number of genuine problems. And then you can ask people again, well, here's the problem. Can you think of any way, if you could conceptualize how things would be better in relationship to that problem? Well, what would a solution look like, even in principle? And then they might say, well, I don't know. And then they have to guess and lay their cards out on the table about what a solution might look like. If they say they don't know, that often means they don't want to think about it. And a little bit of encouragement is in order, and maybe a little bit of pressure. But you want people to formulate a vision of what the situation would look like if the problem was solved. And then they might find it very daunting because the solution looks so difficult that they don't see any pathway to it. And so then the next part of the discussion is, well, are there some things that you could do that would be small steps that you would be interested in doing, that you think you would do, that would move you to the solution? And maybe those things could be implemented tentatively. Behavioral psychologists call that collaborative empiricism. So you'll come and see a behavioral psychologist and lay out your problems. And then the two of you will negotiate towards the beginnings of a solution. What could you do this week that might make that problem slightly better? And so you talk through what's practical and what's implementable. And you have to be honest about that, because you don't want to set yourself up with a plan that's so complicated you won't implement it. Then you say to the person, if you're the psychologist, you say, well, look, we got a couple of ideas about what you could do this week that might make this situation slightly better. Why don't you go and implement them, and then come back next week and we'll talk about whether or not that worked. And worked would be you did implement it and that it did have the desired solution. And if it didn't work, meaning you didn't implement it or the solution didn't emerge, then there's the opportunity for renegotiation. So you can think about it strategically. The first issue is, well, if something needs to be sorted out, the first question is, what the hell's the problem? And the answer to that is, you probably don't know. The problem is, I'm upset and disturbed and angry and resentful and bitter and unhappy and anxious and in pain and lonesome. I'm suffering from an excess of negative emotion and perhaps from a certain amount of hopelessness. So the problem is the emotional circumstance, and that might be associated with some real problems, right? Some real practical problems. So you lay all that out and say, okay, well, what does the problem landscape look like, right? So that's the strategic move. And then, as I said, that will generally simplify the problem landscape. Then you do the same thing with a set of potential solutions. Well, what would the solutions look like? Because you're not going to be able to solve a problem unless you at least know what a solution might look like. That would actually, what would you say? That you would find acceptable. And then the next issue is to lay out the strategies for the attainment of that solution. And, sometimes it might be, some of these solutions might be dismal. Like, if you've got someone who's ill in your family, the solution might be, well, we need a cure. That's the only solution that will suffice, but you don't know how to pursue the cure, or maybe one doesn't exist. So then you have to think of, well, a lower order and less satisfying solution, which would be, well, maybe we can cope. We're going to learn to cope with this so that it's the least amount of hell possible. And maybe that's too much. And you might have to say, well, we're going to try to make this next week when we're coping with this better than the last week, and maybe you can't even do that. It has to just be the next day. You look for whatever small steps forward you can take that will make things less wretched and horrible than they currently are, to put it rather bluntly. And that requires the willingness to face the problem, the humility to know that you don't have the solution at hand, the willingness to listen to how the other people that you're talking to formulate the problems and formulate the solutions. It's crucially important, right, to have them do that work themselves. It's also, you could think about it this way too, is that if you listen to someone come up with a solution, you don't undergo the neurological transformations necessary to change your character. But if you come up with the solutions yourself, if you articulate the problem and you articulate the solutions, then you've changed your own character in a way that increases the probability that you're going to act out what you do. And that requires real patience too, to let people stumble through to their own problem solutions. Because someone might lay out a set of problems and you think, oh my God, I know what you could do about that. But it doesn't really matter if and I'm also not saying that sometimes advice is helpful. Sometimes you can give someone a hint. But man, you have to be careful with that, because there's a real element of theft that's associated with it. Now, Richard also asked, how can I talk about the resentments of my childhood in a way that benefits them instead of giving them guilt? I don't know if I can answer that question, Richard, because it's not a question that's, see, what I would ask if you came to talk to me and you had that question, I would say, first of all, well, what resentments? List them out, man. Write them down. Okay. So that you know what they are. because each of those resentments is going to be a different thing, and the strategy that's associated with each might vary as a consequence of the particularity of the resentment. So I would say you should start by writing them down. Like, what's your problem exactly? Here's all the things that I can think of that I'm angry about with regard to my childhood. Write that down. And then see which ones are still living. And then you have to figure out, well, what do you want from your parents exactly? Do you want them to apologize? Do you want them to understand what they did wrong? Do you want to punish them? Do you want to let them learn to know you better? Do you want to change the way they're interacting with you now? Do you want to learn your own lessons from your bad experience so that when you're a parent, you don't make the same mistake? Do you merely want to have a chance to express yourself? Like, it's very difficult to answer your question because I don't know what your goal is, right? So, and I don't need to know, you need to know. What are the resentments? So we can walk through the process we already described. Lay them out. And comprehensively, you might want to make a list of everything that you think you might conceivably be annoyed about with regards to your parents, no matter how trivial, right? Because that way you scour your memory for things that you're holding onto in a bitter way. And maybe you have your justification. I'm not suggesting that you don't, but you need to discover what baggage you're carrying. Then you have to figure out, well, what can I let go of? And what's core? And I would say what's really core is, if there are ways that your parents treated you that are still affecting you or that are affecting your relationships with them now, those really need to be dealt with because they're not done. They're not in the past, right? They're not even resentments of your childhood. They're still part of your ongoing life. And so, okay, so now you have all your resentments laid out. I guess I would say, something like, look, Mom and Dad, there's something I need to talk to you about that's been bothering me for a long time. And I'd pick one of the more trivial things to begin with. Like, here's a memory I have, and don't get all high and mighty about it because, you might have misconstrued the situation as a child. It's highly probable, and they may have had their reasons, and you may not even remember the situation, let's say, correctly, or the way they remember it. To say, well, here's something that happened when I was a kid, and it still bothers me. And do you remember what happened? That's an open-ended question. Do you remember what happened? Why did this go this way? And then I would do an awful lot of listening, because you are trying to gather information. And the more your parents can tell you about what happened in those situations, I would say the better off you're likely to be. So that's about all I can say about that. That's a fairly delineated approach to general discussions about difficult things, right? But I would say don't be more afraid of engaging in this process than you are afraid of not engaging in it. Like, every relationship you have is going to have problems in it. And, you don't want to jump to a intense psychological discussion with every little bump. But if there's something of medium to long-term permanence that's disturbing you, or a pattern that repeats itself at least 3 times, let's say, well, then that might be something that's worthy of discussion, or your discovery that you're, very dissatisfied with the way the relationship is going. And you have to have the conflict necessary to sort that out. And it's going to be conflict with you and the person that you're talking to, but the aim should be the establishment of something like fully informed, fully negotiated, medium to long-term peace. That's what you're aiming at, if you have any sense.